Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Alyssa Shibata.
I'm Clay Horton.
I'm Daniel Humbert.
And this is our final episode of the Se7en Podcast. We've had a lot of fun going through the 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues with you. Today we're focusing on greed, generosity, gluttony, and self-control. But before we dive into it, I just want to invite you in the month of July to join us for At the Movies. It's an annual worship series that we do where we take a look at some of the most popular movies in the past year and figure out where can we find God in those. In the month of July, we are not going to have any podcasts, but we're going to pick it up again in August, where we will have podcasts around the worship series Reality Check, where we're going to be talking about really serious stuff like mental health, bullying, school violence, as we're getting ready to go back to school. So hope you'll join us, where we just keep an eye out for those things coming up. And also, as we dive into conversation, feel free to comment, ask us your questions, participate in the conversation, and we will respond live.
That'll be fun.
Yeah. So let's jump right into greed and generosity. So how do you experience greed personally?
Personally?
Mm-hmm.
Clay, you go first. I don't want to be greedy.
Yeah, thanks. So the place where I feel like the other day we had to kind of limit our water consumption at our house. And so everything I did, I was conserving water. And then after the fact, I realized, wow, I got by with using drastically less water. And I had never thought about the fact that when I, take a longer shower or, do this or that I'm being greedy with water. But in reality, I'm wasting more water and I'm wasting resources that could be used for the kingdom of God when I'm, paying the utility, having a higher utility bill. And it just kind of hit me. I was like, wow, I'm greedy with a lot of things in my own daily life that just kind of build upon each other, right?
So you think wasting resources is a form of greed?
Absolutely.
I never even considered that.
Yeah, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think about it on two levels that are, kind of simple, and yet, so certain foods in the house that I like, that I want, I get really greedy about with Kay or the kids or whatever, want some of that food, and I can literally sense it in my behavior and attitude with them. And then greedy when I'm driving, where I want, either my lane or my speed or my, my way down the highway, quite literally. I get really greedy about, and I realize when I'm interacting with other drivers, I think, man, you're just being greedy with the road, quite literally. So just kind of interesting.
Well, I think that, you talked about on Sunday, we have these characters in our mind or famous people that we associate with greed, like the Bernie Madoffs and Ebenezer Scrooge and things like that it's like so obvious that this is what greed looks like. But I think I have a tendency to rationalize my way into greed, and it sneaks up on me. And so, when I'm thinking about donating to an organization, I'm like, but what are they going to do with this money? How are they going to use it? Or will the little bit that I can give really make a difference? Probably not. Might as well keep it, And so I rationalize my way into it. Or if I'm going through my clothes and thinking about what to donate, I'm like, oh, they probably can't even use this. I might as well keep it,
I think what was most fascinating to me in doing the research was I talked about sort of the two components of the definition, right? This inordinate desire for things, but the second component, at the expense of relationship. And the at the expense of relationship, I think, was critical to me because I couldn't help but think of that in two specific ways. The relationship with God, and in part that's what you're talking about, I think, with regard to resources and things like that, but also like on the road if I'm getting angry and it's sort of, hindering my relationship with God. But also relationship with people. If it's hindering my relationship with people because I'm so focused on I want this thing or I want to do this thing, I think that was most fascinating to me. And I think what is going to help me personally think more about, am I getting sucked in? Because I think you're right, Alyssa. It just sort of gradually sucks you in. I don't think it just is overt. I'm, at least for me, I don't think it's overt. I think it just sort of sneaks in.
Yeah. And So in Erin's job, she's kind of paid more on commission. So the more she works, the more money we make, which is we've had to kind of live into a spot of making sure she works the hours that she needs to work to have what we need, but recognizing that her being home and us having family time, the relationship piece is extremely important. Yep. So instead of being in the mindset, work every single hour you can, pick up every extra day you can, kind of stepping back and going, oh, but that's not the be all end all. It's the relationships that we need that are just as important. So there's always that struggle there.
That's right.
So how do you think the church has been greedy? Because one of the questions I had for you is, do you think greed can go beyond money? And I feel like you've already answered that with talking about, being greedy on the road, greedy and wasting resources, things like that. But how do you think the church has lived into greed?
Well, I think one way that, and I think we're guilty of this right here at Trietsch, even though I don't like it, is, we think about how we can be in service to the world or service to our community. And clearly we want to do that. I think in general we do a really good job of that. But I think there's that greed of, well, we're only going to do this if we can either charge you a fee for the use of the building, or we're going to only do this if it reaches just certain kinds of people, including just church members. I think that's greedy. And I think every church is guilty of that to the degree, on another simple level, wedding fees for the use of the building. We charge a different fee for those who are not members than those who are members, and you kind of wonder, well, why is that? I mean, what's the necessity of that? I think probably one of the necessities of that is greed. That's not a necessity, obviously, but I think that's where that comes from.
I'm going to throw out a strong word here. Sounds like bribery to me. Join our church and you get a discount.
Yeah, well, that's what that created. I think that's an old model, and in some of my previous churches, we actually got rid of that model. But I think the model was we want to encourage people to join so that they'll be a part of us, right? What we discovered was, not just here but at other churches, was people were only joining to do the wedding, and then we never saw them again, right? So, yeah. But that's what greed does. It's this, I'm going to say a bad word, I shouldn't, but it's a corruption. So I'll say that word. That'll be a better word. It's a corruption of the relationship, the whole design of that. So anyway, I think we may get off course. I don't know.
Well, and I had, and this might be reaching, but when I was trying to think about how has the church been greedy, there are very obvious examples, like a megachurch pastor who wanted to buy a jet for ministry, things like that we see the headlines, we see where the church isn't necessarily living into the virtue of generosity. But I was also wondering, can you get greedy with theology, with ideas? Can greed equate to stubbornness of, this is the way, like, I'm collecting all of these ideas, I'm collecting all of this theology, and this is what it is, and I am not open to understanding it in a different way. Could that be considered a greedy mindset, or am I off base here?
I wonder if that's more pride than greed. That's what
Maybe.
I would think.
Yeah.
As you describe that, I consider that more an issue of pride, that I must do it this way, I believe only this way, you can't change that because I'm stubborn. I don't know, that I look at it more as pride.
Yeah, I see that more as pride, but I think in areas of serving ministries, we can have the mindset of we are the ones who are going to own this serving opportunity, or we can be of the mindset of God's already at work in all of these areas, and we are going to go partner with this ministry and this ministry and this church to do some good. But if we try to own different serving ministries in the community, I think we're trying to own it because we're greedy, because we want the recognition. We want to say we, give ourselves the glory, as opposed to when there's partnerships. Our interfaith build for Habitat for Humanity was, Trietsch didn't own that house or own that build. We worked with so many faith communities, and each faith community came and said, we're all going to live into, this form of charity and generosity. Yeah. And it was beautiful.
Well, and I think like a good point as we transition to talking about generosity is, I think generosity is so much about crossing lines, getting out of those silos and extending, because one of the areas that I've seen generosity over the past weekend is I am a member of Oaklawn United Methodist Church, and they have opened up their doors to asylum seekers.
Yep.
And when I showed up to the volunteer training on Saturday morning, I think they set up enough chairs for maybe 50 to 75 people. 200 people showed up for volunteer training. And these are people across races, across languages, across religions. Like, we had an imam there helping guide us through prayer. Like, we had everyone coming together and that was just a miraculous example of generosity that, of course, the Christian faith was represented, but it had nothing to do with Christianity specifically. It had to do with a bigger understanding of humanity,
right,
and what it is to love and to be generous to another community. That's who are in need, the marginalized.
Yeah, and that's where the beauty of that virtue is helpful, particularly, again, back to that second leg of the definition of greed, where relationship becomes critical, and why the virtue of generosity is so helpful is because generosity is not about self. It's about the other. So I don't care about your religion, and I don't care about your ethnicity. What I care about is you. And I want to give my time to you and help you out and be generous with that stuff. That's why that virtue is so powerful. Yeah.
I loved your analogy. I mean, you said it several times on Sundays. If we hold whatever we're holding like this, then we cannot be generous. And so it's almost an approach to life where we are going with life with open hands.
Right.
Of God, what do I need to give? And then in that same stance, we're also receiving. And as I have a tendency, maybe it's the prideful side of me, when I see other people being more greedy or walking through life like this, then I get a judgmental stance towards them often. And then you cause me to think about, I need to change my stance towards them as they're missing opportunities to receive blessings. Yeah, that's cool. And kind of mourn for them as opposed to be frustrated with them.
Right, and I don't think anyone is intentionally greedy. I don't think they come in with the mindset of like, I'm going to be greedy. I think it comes from a place of fear. Yep. I want to protect my family. I want to protect my comfort. I want to protect my way of living. And greed is a side effect of that. Yep. But I think oftentimes we do look at those people and be like, oh, you've become, just this epitome of greed, and why are you choosing to live that way? Well, they may not see it that way at all.
And I do think it's the irony of greed, because I think it creeps in that way because you think, I'm going to get more, and I'm going to achieve more, and I'm going to accomplish more, and I'm certainly going to get more. But ultimately, it tears away at all of that, and it creates scarcity and isolation and fear and all those things. So it is the irony of it.
So what are some practical ways that we can work on living into generosity?
Well, I mean, I think the solutions for all of these are the spiritual practices. I mean, I just think prayer is helpful, gratitude is helpful, a recognition of my impact on the world, like the resources you identified, just acknowledgement of those things. I was thinking, I started going to gluttony already, so...
Yeah, I'm in a group going through a neighboring curriculum right now, and part of the curriculum teaches to have a mindset of abundance and to walk through all of life with an abundance mentality. I have enough time. I have enough resources. And as we just walk with that one word, abundance, then all of a sudden I've got more time to talk to my neighbor, and I've got more time to go help them with their branches that fell down, and I've got more, and I'm able to share that, and so that leads into the generosity. But walking with that versus a scarcity model says, I don't have time, I don't have resources to help in this capacity. So it's just a shift of mindset.
That's what I wrote it down is, asking myself the question, how can I be generous in this situation? And going through, is it with my time? Is it with my voice? Is it with my belongings? Is it with my money? Like, what is the way that I can live generously towards this person? And maybe it is as simple as using your voice to a lot of times I think that when we are driving, I live in the city of Dallas, and so the homeless population is right outside my doorstep at all times. And I don't always have cash in the car. I don't always have, a bag of food that I can hand out. But what I can do is roll down the window and say, "How are you today?"
That's right.
And that is being generous with my voice. And I don't do that as often as I should because I get so caught up in I have nothing physical to give.
That's great. I love that. And I do think I think that's a great question. How can I be generous in this circumstance? Yeah, that's cool.
So, gluttony?
Gluttony. I'm hungry. Shall we eat?
Oh my gosh. Gluttony, for me, it is all about binging shows and podcasts, and I can ruin an entire Saturday by watching a series beginning to end.
Wow.
Forget to go to the bathroom. Forget to eat meals. Like, I am all in. And
So
man,
you mix the sloth in there too? Then,
I did. It's all there. It's all there.
Isn't
But
that
I
funny?
think there's so many new and interesting ways to be gluttonous in this day and age.
Yeah, and I do think it's important that you share that because the obvious thing that most people associate is food, right? And clearly food is associated, but it really is just the things you've just described. It's anything that I overconsume can be gluttonous.
Oh, and food too. I mean, confession time. I made a batch of muffins last week, and I brought them into church to share. And people ate 3 of them, and I was like, oh, I might as well take the rest home. And in the course of 3 days, I ate 9 muffins by myself.
Way to go. Well, see, I'd have eaten all 9 the rest
But
of the day.
I could have easily just left them here for people to enjoy. And I was like, oh, I made them. They're mine. So it's greed and gluttony.
See?
Yeah.
There's that human condition. There you go.
So, kind of cool mixture of living into the generosity that I think my kids have helped me live into. Going through that neighboring curriculum, one of the challenges for the day for the week, was to share food with a neighbor. And then my kids were up at church childcare, and Shannon was awesome, and she decorated cookies with the kids.
Oh, wow.
And so each kid came home with a dozen cookies, beautifully decorated cookies. So the gluttonous side of me says, we are gonna
We're
go to
eating those
town.
things, yeah.
Cookies for dinner.
But I love a sweet tooth, so I would have loved to do that. But this curriculum was reminding me to be generous, and so I'm looking at those, and I was like, well, what happens if we go share a couple with our neighbors? And then in that act of doing that, the mom said, oh my gosh, I've been wanting to get your phone number because my son stays, alone sometimes in the summer, and it would be great for him to have a contact of an adult. And so we live into that, and then we go and we met some new neighbors, and it was just that balance of we could have lived into gluttony, and there's many times when I do, but that kind of nudge from that curriculum that said, oh no, go be generous with this. Don't be greedy.
Well, and gluttony and greed are tied together so much. But, on our bookmark, which... pick up a bookmark.
Yeah.
It says gluttony is the inordinate desire for excess, including food, goods, and relationships. And that's the one that I just didn't quite understand of being gluttonous in relationships. So can you explain that to me a little bit?
Well, so I think what I glean from that is, while I wholeheartedly believe that addiction of any kind is an illness and it's something that is sort of beyond our control, though we have certain components of control, almost anything you might think of with regard to addictions. So food, alcohol, drugs, sex, relationships, purchasing, all of that can be sort of analogous in gluttony. In other words, we can oversubscribe. So gluttonous relationship would be one that's completely one-sided, where all I want to do is just be with you, and I won't be with anybody else, whether friendship or otherwise. It's where I take advantage, perhaps on the other end of that spectrum, where I take advantage of somebody in relationship in terms of how I relate and what I want out of the relationship. I think that's what we mean by that.
Well, and someone just asked a question. Can we be gluttonous with our thoughts, like negativity or things like that?
Wow. I suppose you could. I don't know. I've never thought of it that way.
Maybe
That's
becoming
interesting.
obsessed with an idea or and unwilling to accept other people's input could be a form of gluttony. I don't know.
I don't know either. I've just never thought about that. That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
And
we don't have an answer, sorry.
Yeah, well, but I don't know whether it's fear or anger or hate. Colson today was asking if he could hate wasps, and then he wants to know what he can hate. He focuses a lot on what am I allowed to hate. Wow. And I had to think, how do we have this conversation? But so I just got these new glasses. Brenda was wearing them for a little bit today. And then I told her, if you wear them too long, it ruins your eyesight. And it's okay to put them on, but if you were to wear these all the time, it shifts how you would see the rest of the world when you take them off. And I think if we are gluttonous with thoughts of fear, anger, hate, and we wear those glasses too often, then it almost ruins our eyesight. And then we see the rest of the world in a negative light as opposed to positive light.
Yeah, I agree. Kay, my wife, taught me a word years ago out of the medical industry called, I've lost the word, perseverate. And perseverate means thinking on these things over and over and over. Good, yeah. Ooh. Perseverate. And so if we think of things obsessively, then that's what perseveration means. So, yeah, I guess you could be gluttonous in that, right? That it just kind of overdoes itself.
So if you're about to buy something new, I mean, when you make a big purchase, sometimes there's a little bit of research, but I wonder if we could be for myself, gluttonous in how much time and energy we spend thinking about that next thing we're going to buy, and if that negates, the capacity to do other things or have better thoughts, then that's gluttonous. Yeah.
So how has our world been impacted by gluttony?
Ooh.
Besides, we're obese.
Well, we can go in all kinds of directions on that, I think. Yeah. So the first thing that came to my mind were these trash barges that get shipped from country to country, right? Mm-hmm. We've got these massive barges that are just full of crap, trash, yuck. And it's because we've got no place else to put it. And I think gluttony has caused us to do that, right? After that tsunami a couple of years ago from Japan, where halfway across the globe we start seeing the trash piling up because we've had this desire and this inordinate yearning to buy stuff, to create stuff. That's gluttonous. I think that's one way.
I think that for me it's we just love filling our time with things that don't matter. Or if we're bored or if we're idle, might as well have a plate of nachos, I think that so much can come out of idle time, and we fill that time with gluttonous behaviors because if I've got nothing to do on a Saturday, rather than doing something productive, I'll sit down and watch a season of Game of Thrones or whatever it is.
There really is that connection that you pointed out between sloth and gluttony.
Yeah.
We part of what we've discovered, of course, during this series is how interrelated these things are, right? These 7 deadly sins. And you're right. Food gluttony for me is all about boredom. When I'm bored, literally my go-to event is to go eat if I'm bored.
Well, what about self-control? Because I think I'm really good at self-control until I'm not, and then I'm off the wagon and I go into so I can be very diligent, but if I slip up one time, I'm like, well, there goes that. Might as well eat whatever I want, know. Yeah. And sometimes I wonder if too much self-control can be a problem of to the point of deprivation. Self-control, and maybe it's the motivation behind your self-control that matters, but I think that if you impose too much self-control and experience no joy out of life, that can also be unhealthy.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, but I think the goal of self-control is not to remove joy, but to sort of maintain balance. And so as long as we can recognize that we're trying to maintain balance, and again, it goes to relationship, to food, to, drugs or alcohol or any other thing, how do I have a balance in my life versus just like fasting, right? Fasting is a form of self-control and it's a form of spiritual practice. The goal of fasting is not to starve to death. The goal of fasting is not to make me suffer. The goal of fasting is not to say, golly, you just need to abstain from all things, but rather the goal of fasting is to, renew my commitment to God, my connection with God, perhaps even my connection with others. So the goal of self-control is positive, but just like anything else, it could be taken to the extreme.
Well, and I think of all of the cures for the deadly sins, self-control probably takes the most practice. Like, it's embedded into you as a child and the habits that you start to form. Like, how can you, I was trying to think about like tips that we can give people for self-control, and I was at a loss. I'm like, either you got it or you don't. Like,
isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Part of what I'll share this week is I really do think this has the highest degree of correlation to the spiritual practices. I think prayer and journaling, for instance, like journaling the food that I take might help lead to less gluttony. If I read what I'm eating, oh my gosh, right? Or certainly fasting. And of course, we've discovered over the years that fasting clearly doesn't have to be with food. It could be from media. It could be from, all day, endeavors with television or whatever. We can fast from lots of different things. I think this is one of the highest degrees of correlation to spiritual practices, this particular virtue, because all of the spiritual practices can help in this endeavor.
Can you become gluttonous and self-control? Like OCD and...
Well, I think that's that perseverating.
Yeah.
I think that's, yeah.
Okay.
And I think a form of self-control is also in budgeting. And budgeting, for some people, is a bad word, but I think as a whole, it allows us to have self-control and control of the budget. And so that you talked about it, can we go overboard? And for me, budgeting has said, oh, we can go out to eat.
Right.
But we're going to spend X amount of money, and if I budget, we're not going to be gluttonous in how we go out to eat.
Right.
And we're going to be generous because the tithe is the very first thing we budget for. And and then that shapes how I see the rest of the budget. It's all part of God's money. And so then I just divide it out. And that has helped us both be kind of live into those places and go, okay, it is okay and healthy to go spend some money here, but we're not going to go overboard.
Well, and that's where I think the idea of balance and I just find self-control to be so interesting as a cure, because even in that example with budgeting and self-control, you can go to the extreme that it turns into greed.
Yes.
I'm so focused on my budget and what money is going where that there will be no extras and we're cutting back on everything. And that's self-control to the extreme that it turns into a sin, which is so crazy, because I feel like this is the first virtue that I feel like can become sinful if you go too far.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? I also think of self-control as boundaries. I think boundaries are so helpful on all levels, right? They're helpful in relationships. They're helpful, for instance, in financial planning, because as you rightfully point out in financial planning, so I've got these boundaries that say I can only go so far, but it also gives me freedom to know I can still have fun. I can still enjoy life. I just need to figure out what the best way to do that is.
Well, and that's maybe where the spiritual practices come in, because in all these, we set boundaries, we set budgets, whatever we're doing. If we're walking with the Holy Spirit, I think it's in those moments where we say, well, this was our boundary, but God is calling me to move outside this boundary. But if God's calling us to move outside that, then we need to move the boundary. Yep. But if it's moving the boundary because I want to move the boundary, then I'm leading into one of these other sins. But that's a daily, throughout the day connection with God that helps us understand where God's leading us.
How about that deal, what you said earlier, Alyssa, about this is the one virtue that has the potential to sort of, overleap. So the one commonality between all the sins and all the virtues is sins are all about self, virtues are all about others. So I do think it begs the question, how is self-control about others? How is it about serving others, and how is it about...
question.
So I think we need to ponder that, right? I'm not sure I've got an answer literally right now, but I think that becomes the way it remains a virtue is, how does this self-control for me turn into benefit for others?
In so many ways, when I look at throughout the rest of the world, there is just a void, right? There's 20,000 kids that will die today because of poverty, right? There's lack of water, there's lack of food, there's all this lack, right? And so that either falls on God for creating a world that didn't have enough resources, or that falls on humanity for not having enough self-control to make sure that we have shared well the resources God has provided. And so if we practice self-control, then we learn that God has created a world that's pretty awesome, and there is enough for all people. And so that's where that virtue, if we practice self-control, we're living in a world of abundance and enough.
And that's a great thought to end on, because we're out of time. But thank you so much for joining us in this 7 podcast. We had a great time talking about the sins and virtues. Don't forget to join us in July for At the Movies. You can go to tmumc.org/worship to see a list of all the movies we'll be covering. And we will see you back again for our podcast in August. Again, as we talk about reality check, mental health, bullying, school violence, and how faith plays into all of that and what we can do to impact the world around us. So thanks again. So glad that you joined us for these past few weeks.
Thanks, y'all.